Yeah, that's right. Because I think those series we did on them.
Morning. How is this? Here. So we're going to be embarking on a completely different journey than you experienced last week with Dan Weiss. So if you were here for class last week and sat through the fast forward facts and questions and articles, chill. We're really looking at something that is much more internal today and reflective, and really excited to share some information about Moses, additional information about Moses and the potential spiritual journey that he took and what we can learn from that today. Today, Carl and I are going to build the bridge that will take Moses from Sinai to Egypt, from Moses as murderer to Moses as carrier of God's commandments. We're going to focus more on his essence than his actions, not on what he does or will do, but on who he is and who he becomes through the process of spiritual transformation. And most importantly, how God encounters Moses in the deepest places of his being as he grows and grooms him into the leader that he's called to be. But before we get into that, we have to get clarity on a few definitions, because these are going to be a very important part of our conversation today. So the first one, there's not a lot in the Bible about this one. What is a soul?
We want us to go ahead.
Not rhetorical question, just a few hands. What do you think? What is the soul? How would you describe it if someone said, I mean, we hear it in our language, right? We heard it today. It is well with your soul. What does that mean? What is your soul?
It's where the Holy Spirit lives.
Where the Holy Spirit lives.
It's our very being.
Our very being. I love the word being, yeah.
Our integrity.
Our integrity, so possibly some of our character and values rest in that place. I asked around a little bit. Yep.
Dimension of our life that is not physical.
Yeah, the non-physical. That dimension of our life that isn't physical. Technically, can't see it, hear it, feel it, touch it, taste it, right? It's something unknown. I asked around a little bit, and the definitions I got from some people were very similar. Your soul is your inner being that knows God and knows what God wants of you. The part of who we are as a being in the universe. And we are all connected at this level. What makes you uniquely you that no one can take away, that comes from God and returns to God. From Matthew 11:28-29, come to me, all you that are weary and are carrying heavy burdens, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and humble in heart, and you'll find rest for your soul, for that place. The definition we're using today is very similar to all of this, and it comes from a book called Strengthening the Soul of Your Leadership by Ruth Haley Barton. And Ruth Haley Barton is a spiritual director, speaker, and teacher, the founder of the Transforming Center. She holds a Doctor of Divinity from Northern Seminary. She's also an author of many other books that are directed towards spiritual formation and Christian leadership, and she is a resource that we have used in Stephen Ministry as we answer these tough questions or dig into what is the soul and what is meant by transformation. Because these are conversations that we might have with our care receivers as they're exploring their relationship with God, and they want to know, well, there's more to this, isn't it? These are things that we want to be able to share and talk about and listen and kind of have a feel for it. So what Ruth says, the definition of a soul for her is the part of you that is most real, the very essence of you that God knew before you were brought forth in physical form, the part that will exist after your body goes into the ground. This is the you that exists beyond any role you play, any job you perform, any relationship that seems to define you, or any notoriety or success that you may have achieved. Your essence. Does that make sense? Okay, so we're kind of in agreement there. Okay. So next, what is spiritual transformation? Obviously, there's no wrong answer. There's only exciting, interesting answers that will pique our curiosity. So if you have anything floating around, otherwise I've got one. Spiritual transformation, the process by which Christ is formed in us for the glory of God, for the abundance of our own lives and for the sake of others. An organic process that goes far beyond mere behavioral tweaks to work deep fundamental changes at the very core of our being. In the process of transformation, the Spirit of God moves us from behaviors that are motivated by fear and self-protection to trust and abandonment in God. From selfishness and self-absorption to freely offering the gifts of the authentic self. And it frees us from the ego's desperate attempts. The ego is that part of you that is in the driver's seat most of the time, that directs your thoughts, your words, your actions often. A necessary thing, but something that we can all work on to soften and gentle a little bit by digging into the depths of our soul, our spirit, or the God place. But it's Spirit of God in the process of transformation affects the ego's desperate attempts to control the outcomes of our lives, to an ability to give ourselves over to the unknown and the uncertain. And what do we call that?
Faith.
Yeah, faith. Yeah, getting more comfortable with what we don't understand, with what we can't see and feel and touch, with not knowing where this is going, with not fully understanding where it's been, but being okay with just being right here in the center of it all with God. It is a process, spiritual transformation is a process full of mystery and can only be grasped and experienced through divine intervention. And that absolutely is the key to everything. God initiates, God guides, and brings it to fruition. But, and what this book talks about and what spiritual formation is all about, the one thing we can do, we can create the conditions inside that set us up for an encounter with God in the places where we need it most. To be receptive, I like to think about it as I'm in the receptive mode, or I'm in the place where I'm still enough and quiet enough and settled enough to let God get through all the stuff that my ego is doing, or all that's going on around me, or all that's on Facebook, right? We can get centered in this spot. So today, Carl and I want to follow Moses through that process of transformation. There's more than meets the eye with his story. Into the spiritual practices that might have opened him up and created those conditions that allowed him to be present to God. Because he did have to hear, he did have to believe, he did have to seek. And as we know, he started out as, right, the murderer, runs away, winds up encountering God, but what happened in between? We will not get anywhere near the miracles or the magic of Egypt. What we will understand is that this first leg of Moses' journey as a leader was not to lead anyone anywhere. It was to allow himself to be led into freedom from his own bondage. So, what's the first place we go? So the first practice we're going to talk about a little is the spiritual practice of self-examination. In the church, lots of times you'll see something called the examen, a process, and those are the actual specific steps, usually done at the end of the day, where you connect with yourself and figure out, how was my day? Where did I see God? Where did I turn away from God? And what's my hope for tomorrow? In general, those are the steps that you might go through in the examen. But the process of self-examination was necessary because from Exodus we know one day after Moses had grown up, he saw an Egyptian beating a Hebrew, one of his kinsfolk, right? He looked this way and that, obviously he doesn't want to get caught, and seeing no one, he killed the Egyptian and hid him in the sand. Moses fled from Pharaoh, and he settled in the land of Midian and sat down by a well. And while we want to be super careful here about imposing our own meanings on ancient texts, we have to at least kind of acknowledge here that with Moses, he was born into a pretty unsafe and volatile situation. He was abandoned, even though it was for a very good reason, as we heard this morning. Then he was raised in a pagan environment. He's an outsider among his own people and among the Egyptians who raised him. So where does he fit in? You know, are these things that he's thinking about? Where do I fit in? Where can I be the real me? It's likely that he developed some coping mechanisms for dealing with the pain and the uncertainty of his situation, like all of us might. When difficulties are present, what do? We cope, right? We figure out ways to deal with it. We develop patterns before we're conscious that we're doing so, and it just becomes a normal way of operating for us. It appears that one of Moses' coping mechanisms was to repress his anger, since he had nowhere to go with it. And so it's when he's still living as an Egyptian that he went out to his people, who aren't really officially his people. You know, he's still kind of living in two worlds. He witnesses the abuse of a Hebrew slave and kills the aggressor, who's an Egyptian. He tries to hide the body in the sand, clever. Then comes back the next day and tries to help the Hebrews. And they're like, no, they weren't having that. They didn't understand him. They didn't trust him. They didn't know where he was coming from. Who is this guy who says he's there to help them, who they just saw kill someone the day before? It doesn't matter if it was a bad guy. You know, this creates some confusion and uncertainty for them. They saw what he did, and this makes Moses afraid, right? So here's where the whole idea of the shadow self comes in. What had been present under the surface was now on the surface, out in the open, and can no longer be ignored. And this isn't just referring to the fact of what he did, right? That thing that he did. Because remember, we're talking about the deep part of him. This is what has been underneath maybe for years. The author speculates that this is Moses' shadow self, a place of anger, like I said, anger and uncertainty and frustration, not knowing where he stood. For us, it's the part of us that we try to hide, because who wants to see that crummy part of yourself, right? We work very hard at keeping our shadow self hidden. But our awareness of this, of the shadow self, or lack of awareness, doesn't make it any less real. We all have it. We all have something that we are either aware of or not aware of, and are keeping, that we learned along the way, right? That we're keeping hidden, that isn't consistent with that thing we talked about before, with the soul, the essence, the God spark, the place where God is living and waiting for us to return. It gets referred to later on as the true self, but that really great spot, you know, coexisting with that is our shadow self. So if we act as Moses did, we might run too, right? Fast and far away. In Moses' case, clearly he's running because he's afraid. He doesn't want to be found out by Pharaoh. We might run from a situation or from the reality of who we are and what we might do. And I want to stop for a question here. Two questions, actually. And these are meant for everyone to just ponder, and then can call out an answer if you'd like. How do you respond to the idea that we have these coping strategies and that we develop them from a young age? Or, what are some of the other ways we react when we catch a glimpse of our own shadow self? Moses runs, right? He's going to get away from it, obviously preserving his own life. But in this situation, he runs. He doesn't know what else to do. Maybe he's afraid of himself as well as the punishment. I think he's maybe at a point of pretty severe confusion about himself and where his life is headed. Again, back to the beginning. Who is he? So when you've caught a glimpse of your shadow self, what's something you might have done? And we can talk about this in the third person too, obviously, because no one's gonna like open up with your whole shadow self here, but I think of the unhealthy coping we can do. Drinking, shopping. Well, that's not always unhealthy, but too much.
If I were considering becoming a Christian, one of the things that I like about the Christian position is the idea that transformation is possible. One of the things I can't stand about news pundits and people who are on TV is that they'll spend a lot of time exploring somebody's life who is running for office, let's say, and found out that they said something or did something way back when. Do you know that that person did this? And then for days on TV, every other pundit repeats the same old thing because none of them believe in transformation. That isn't a possibility for a person who doesn't think from a Christian perspective. So one of the things that I appreciate about the coping strategies that we have is that we realize that we can change and we should change. Otherwise, we're dead-end street people.
I really like your distinction too about the Christian practice of this, because in this practice, we're looking at deep, fundamental, life-changing, down to the core changes, not just behavioral tweaks or modifications. And I think that's where the difference is. And we can go to a lot of great, wonderful therapists and healers and helpers for that. We're talking about something a little bit different, so that's a really good point.
You were asking if you've caught a glimpse of your shadow side, what might you do? And I think sometimes people, that kind of, instead of getting angry at yourself, you get angry at other people. It like leaks out onto other people.
Yeah. Emotions, all kinds of them. And, you know, we can even speculate that that's what was happening here. If Moses was wrestling with his shadow self and just couldn't take it anymore and saw this Hebrew being abused, he reacted out of anger. Anybody else? Yep.
I think a really common response is denial,
Yeah.
and maybe digging down even deeper into what you did was okay.
Yeah, and an incident can kind of help to spark a desire to transform, but sometimes there's not even an incident, there's just a general sense of unease that something's not right in my life about how I'm handling this or how I'm responding or just who I am in this situation or with this person, and then it's even harder, right? You can brush it away because there isn't like this murder right in front of you going, hey, something needs to happen to change. So it can require some thought, and we're gonna get into a little more of how we get there. Did you have anything else?
On coping strategies, I think we develop those from a very young age, as it says up there, and sort of unknowingly do that, and you get to a point and you say, well, why do I do that? And then you sort of realize why you do that. So it takes a while to understand the motivation behind the coping strategies.
Yeah, and I think that's where therapy can come into. Because she does go into some detail with that in the book, but we didn't want to go too much into the psychoanalysis. But we all can agree that there is something there sometimes, something lurking beneath the surface. And so Moses decides to run, and he runs to Midian, and he winds up at a well. And he settles into himself in solitude. And beyond the functional purpose of the well, because we can assume maybe he was thirsty, right? There's a meaning that the well has long been a metaphor for the soul. The hidden riches and depths of a person exists there in that deep place. Water is an image of this hidden world, a symbol of the unconscious, containing life that is invisible, but full of wrecks and treasures. There's a lot brewing there beneath the surface. Water can also represent the deep interior presence of God. Jesus is the living water. How about baptism, we just talked about? And we can speculate here again that maybe Moses is here not just to get a drink of water, but to settle in and take a deeper look, knowing that something needs to change. And my last point here is on solitude. So here he is by himself, essentially. And even when he's surrounded by people as the years go on, I think he's a shepherd. He's in a kind of an isolating occupation, right? But one of the primary functions of solitude is to settle into ourselves in God's presence. It's not easy, and it takes time. It takes time to get comfortable with being alone. But have you ever spoken with someone who says, in the context of their conversation, I feel lost, like I don't know where to go. I don't know how to make this decision. I'm back and forth, all that. This is the first place, deep. It's the cry of the heart and the soul. And in solitude, we can find ourselves again. But, I'm going to say it again, make no mistake, the most important stuff that's happening to our soul in solitude, remember the soul comes from God. At this point, it is below the surface, and likely only God is aware of it. So, if we start to do our initial digging and figuring this out and looking at our ways that we've been coping, our examples of things that aren't working in our life, it can be too easy to stop there and then, right, I'm just going to work on being more patient. Or gratitude, it's a great thing. I'm going to practice gratitude, and I do think it's a spiritual practice, but what we're talking about here, again, is getting into a very deep reflective place at the well and just being present with God and starting an experience of solitude.
Sue, does the journey play into that too? Is that a metaphor of traveling, that somehow pilgrimage or movement, or sometimes that can be another
Mhm.
something like that.
Yeah. Yeah, and that reflects on the fact that it does take time, and that it's not just overnight. So, Carl's gonna talk about the practice of solitude and silence.
So I'm an expert on solitude because I'm an introvert. I just love it, can't get enough of it. And I know how to use it. I think I know how to use it. I think the interesting thing about these practices is that they build upon one another. The practice of, to make them useful, the practice of self-examination is so important first. You need to go into this practice of solitude after examining yourself, having sort of realizing the conflict within you and to say, I need to work on that. So you bring sort of a mission into the period of solitude. So in Moses' case, the reading here is that Moses named his son Gershom, for he said, I have been an alien residing in a foreign land. Now the name Gershom, what I've read, is that's from the Hebrew language. That sounds like a word in Hebrew for foreigner in a strange land. So Moses, by naming his son that, was acknowledging his conflict, that he was a person in a strange land, and he was trying to resolve those feelings. It takes, as Sue mentioned, it takes a long time for each of these practices. Moses had been in Midian for, we're not ever sure, but months, maybe years. And his conflict comes up in a couple places. It's noted in the Bible verse when Zipporah, before she was his wife, she introduced him to her father Jethro as a Hebrew, and Moses didn't try to correct her. He just went with that, but he knew he wasn't. I'm sorry. As an Egyptian, I'm sorry. He introduced him as an Egyptian. He knew he wasn't, but he didn't try to correct her. And he really spent months there in solitude, in that place of tending sheep, thinking about his situation. And it was finally sort of when he names his son that he claims who he was. He could say that the experience of living with an alien has shaped me, to recognize he didn't know exactly what he was going to be, but realized that living in an alien land there has shaped him as a person. So what does that mean in our own lives? Where can we see that in our own lives? When we go into a period of solitude, it's best to go in with a sort of, at least for me, when I need to reflect and sit quietly, to go in with a mission, something I want to think about. Oftentimes if I wake up at 3 a.m., that's the bad time to wake up because it's really hard to get to sleep, but I think Connor Williams always says, well, that's the time God is talking to you, and that you have at least a half hour until you're going to fall asleep, so let's use that time in solitude and really think through what's on our mind, what we need to achieve. So that's the time we can reflect on our own behavior when we think about the coping skills we've developed over our lives, those reflective and unconscious things we do to survive, and for me to survive in the social world with 30 people looking at me. It takes some coping skills and some practice. But reflect on those and how do I develop energy from that. Another thing that there's a sort of spiritual law of gravity that when we just let ourselves be still and with our thoughts, open our minds to God's voice, that lets a lot of the anxiety sort of just drop out of us and gives us into a calm space so that we can then be more resourceful as we go into the next practice, which I don't want to spoiler alert, but there's a next practice coming up that you really, to be effective in this next practice, really have to go through that time of quiescence and solitude. So with that, let me ask about how you have used solitude in your life, in your experience, and what is helpful to you in solitude.
Well, I use meditation, and it's a big, hard practice to do that, to just sit and think nothing of not to think of anything, just be silence, but it helps me get calm, it helps me to go through my day, and so.
Gives you that reflective time, the quiet time. Yeah, very good.
If you had a spectrum of human experience, and on one end of the spectrum is solitude, what do you put on the other end of the spectrum? Would it be hyperactivity? I mean, I'm not sure what word to use, but if you stray too far from the center in either direction, you can ask yourself some serious questions about whether you're comfortable moving too far towards solitude. In monasticism, for example, there's a dimension called the via negativa, in which you deny the existence of everything and you just move into nothingness. I'm extremely uncomfortable trying to walk into that direction because I don't know what's there. And I find solitude probably a lot more complicated and problematic than some people do. So I'm just saying that we may all find ourselves at different places on the spectrum.
I think the other end of the spectrum, at least for me from solitude, is distraction and having to do too much in too short a time. Where just one activity builds on another. You have to go quickly from one to another. You can never sort of decompress, and after a while, you can just see you're not doing as well as you need to do if you have too many things scheduled. And then the distraction and noise, it doesn't allow you any time to be reflective, to hear God's voice. So that's how I would see the other end of the spectrum. You have to seek solitude. You got to go find it and create it for yourself. I have a space in my home which is like what you get to after you go through the security line in Milwaukee Airport. They have that sign, recombobulation area. So I guess the other end of solitude is when you take off your shoes and your belt and your cell phone and all this stuff and put no belt, and finally you get at the end of the belt, the recombobulation area, that little quiet space. And my daughter recognized the introvert in me and painted a sign, just eloquently lettered, just like they have it at the airport, set up by my fireplace. So that's my little area. When I need to go find solitude, I go there.
I appreciate the focusing on the self and getting in touch with the shadow self. For me, like Henry Nouwen, who's a great contemplative, he says there's the inward and the outward, like the lungs. It breathes in to nourish ourselves, but then we've got to go out and let go and see how we're being called to a world around us to make it. This is a call story. God, this is all about God, not Moses.
Right.
And how we connect those two. We got to get out of ourselves to get out of ourselves to hear God's call sometimes. That's my concern about both, this inward journey and the outward journey.
You're getting antsy. I think you're getting antsy. We're gonna get there.
Oh,
Well, you've done a great segue to the next
Yeah.
practice, so
I'm
thank you.
sorry, yeah, that's kind of where God is in the story here,
Okay.
thanks.
It is all God, it's all God in the solitude and in the response. It's all God.
Yeah, what's God doing?
We'll see.
Well, you're
It
right.
gets better and better.
Yeah.
You talked about the breathing in, the taking in, and the letting out. The letting of solitude is the letting out of things. Taking in is to be paying attention to what's going on around you, and that's paying attention to God's voice. So we have this very beautiful image here of the burning bush. And so the passage is, there the angel of the Lord appeared to him in a flame of fire out of a bush. He looked, and the bush was blazing, yet he was not consumed. Then Moses said, I must turn aside and look at this great sight. So Moses had been busy there tending flocks of Jethro's sheep. He's herding the cats, herding the sheep up in the hill there. You can just really get too much into yourself, but then God was calling him and had ignited this bush. And Moses knew that he had to leave his solitude and pay attention to this awesome sight. So this is really the spiritual practice of knowing when there's something that is so different, out of the ordinary, that you need to pay attention to it, and taking time to listen to God. We all have, I guess we can all look forward to that in a month or so, when our burning bush shrubs turn from green to red, and those are very physical reminders of that burning bush. But we don't always have such graphic images there. Oftentimes we have to be looking for what's burning, not as a sight in front of us, but maybe burning in our hearts, the concern about what's going on in our hearts, and paying attention again inwardly to how the Holy Spirit is talking to us through what we're feeling. So the Ruth Haley Barton goes into a discussion about consolation and desolation. The way we can, the different ends of the spectrum of our hearts. When we're feeling consoled, we're feeling loved, we're feeling full, we're feeling hopeful of the Holy Spirit, we're feeling very blessed, and that's sort of where we like to be. But we can also feel abandoned, we can feel desolate, we can feel hurt, and then we get maybe back into our shadow self again, but we really want to think about that feeling of desolation and say, how can we get back to the feeling of consolation, feeling of the comfort of God? So part of this practice of paying attention is not just to stop and smell the roses around us, that's good, but also stop and be aware of what's going on in ourselves and think about that as we want to move closer to God and the loving power of God. So this is all part of becoming the intentional self, when we know that we can move the way we feel by being contemplative, by reaching out for God's grace, for God's wisdom, and welcoming that into our lives. So let's talk a couple questions about where in your life you experience a longing to hear from God, one question, or when have you received an unexpected gift from God? Yes.
Well, I would say I haven't experienced a burning bush, but I have experienced in the middle of the night when I can't get back to sleep that God prods me to pray for certain people, and sometimes brings an idea to mind that maybe I should do, and I think, oh no, that's not a good idea. But then the prodding comes another night, and I think, okay, I guess I should write this letter, or I should call this person. And it kind of brings comfort to know that He's helping me along the way.
What a great example. And God is a mystery. We don't know, we don't know why God calls to you in the middle of the night to pray for a certain person. But I would just, based on what we're talking about today, maybe there's a readiness that you might have where you would be more receptive. I mean, I think that's the whole point here. The burning bush comes along because God senses or knows there's a readiness, right? And I think that's all we're talking about today is being ready to see, because we're not going to get a burning bush, but there might be someone who needs our help, or there might be, all the ways that we're called to serve. And part of this is just being ready to see it, and I'm not on my phone right now, I'm going to see this person. You know what I mean? It's the basics like that, paying attention to what's all around us and all the ways God is calling.
Yeah.
It's a great example.
And another thing on that second question, the unexpected gifts we can receive from God. Just to recognize when we have received a gift and be so thankful for it, and to take time to think about what that means in our lives, and to thank God for providing it. Sometimes it's just getting to the end of a long airplane trip and I arrived home and my luggage was there, and that's a gift. When it doesn't happen, man, when the luggage doesn't show up, that wasn't a gift. But when that all happens, that's a gift. That's a gift from God that we can be so thankful for.
For me, here at the church, the experience of forming relationships with people who have been addicted to drugs in the Serenity Inn when we eat together, and now Project Return, people who have been in bondage in prison, and forming real relationships with those folks, and the work that you do, to me, is the unexpected joy of seeing bondages that are being broken,
Yes.
people set free, which I think is kind of the overarching call here for us from Moses.
Very well put. Yeah, I think with the dinners at the guest house and what I do, and sometimes I come away and say, that was a really good experience. And what made it special was that everyone liked the food, but mostly people entered into conversation and you learned something about that person. There was a relationship that won't be there for a long, long time because the guys move on, but it's just really nice to have that connection.
And get out of our comfort
Few
zone.
moments. Yes. So God's gifts are all around us. And that brings us to the next practice of living our calling. I'll turn it back to Sue.
Good stuff.
So Moses decides to go through a period of self-examination, runs away, goes through a period of solitude, gets into a place where God knows, well, he's gonna recognize me in this bush, and sees this burning bush, right? And now, at our last place of spiritual practice, we're gonna talk about the practice of living our calling, which is what the whole story is about. And I'm just gonna read a little bit from the book here, because she's really eloquent with how she summarizes where we've been and where he's gonna head. So when God was sure that he had Moses' undivided attention, the first thing he talked to him about was his calling. Finally, the true God was able to address the real Moses. Can you see Moses, the murderer, fresh from, murdering the Egyptian here in front of the bush right now? What kind of conversation would that have been? Maybe a little more scattered, maybe a little less receptive, maybe frantic, maybe angry. I don't know. We don't know. We only know what Moses was bringing forward after all this time in solitude. And it was a willingness to turn aside and to look and to be okay with what was before him, and to be not completely threatened or scared by the very presence of God. So it's kind of an amazing moment. In our day, it's easy to dismiss the idea of calling as a mere concept. But God called to Moses out of the burning bush, saying, in effect, I know the question about your identity has been a little confusing, but I've always known who you are. You are a Hebrew. No matter where you live, no matter who raised you, no matter how anyone tries to beat it out of you, no one can take that away from you. You know what it is to be displaced. You know what it is to live your life on someone else's terms, to see the injustice of it all, and want to do something about it. In the very essence of your being, you are someone who is not willing to let injustice go unanswered. In his soul, right? This is who he's called to be. Your care for your people and their well-being is deep and genuine. And now that you know who you are, I am calling you to do something out of the essence of your being. You have submitted to the rigors of the wilderness. Come now, and I'll send you to Pharaoh, so that you may bring my people, the sons of Israel, out of Egypt. A very beautiful moment. And here he is on holy ground, right? And Ann talked about that this morning. Holy ground is a big deal. Some things you may experience in these moments. What's the emotion that comes to mind? If you were standing there in a holy ground moment like Moses, what is an emotion that you might have experienced?
Humility.
Humility?
Curiosity.
Curiosity, right?
Awe.
Awe.
Just a question though, that came up is, to me, is that before he was just, he was not, he was a Hebrew, but he was not a follower of God, our God. But did he ever ask for forgiveness for his murder? I don't think I've ever seen anything in the Bible that he ever did. It's just kind of a question that just came up.
I don't know if there's a pastoral response.
I think so.
I don't think so. Yeah, so let's hope that in all these years of solitude, there was a coming to
Yes,
Jesus
right.
moment for him. And maybe clearly there was, if his heart was in a state of readiness to receive that kind of a call from God, right? But on holy ground, things open up. We gain perspective and clarity on how we got there, and things make sense. And we see God woven into the ups and downs of our lives. It's all about God. Being called by God is a spiritual experience in our human existence. God's presence here, intersecting with human life. Pretty profound. So there's no escaping who we are. And calling is not only a matter of being and doing, but also of becoming what we are not yet, because we're called by God to be so. But even in a holy ground moment, even with a burning bush and with all the drama that surrounds that, we can have blinders on and succumb to self-doubt. And what happens? Well, of course, you argue with a burning bush. Who doesn't, right? Who am I? As Ann shared today, who are you? What do I say? And what if they don't believe me? And here's where we'll speculate that Moses' unhealthy patterns that he learned long ago, especially his confusion about his identity and his inability to clearly define himself in relation to others, it really showed up here in his interactions with God. And we all do this. We bring our patterns of relating to others into our relationship with God. If you have an acrimonious relationship with someone, or maybe you're intimidated by someone, you can bring your intimidated self to God. You don't have to, but you can, right? If you're impatient, you can bring your impatient self to God. We relate to God the way we relate to others, but it's not necessary. It's just something we do. God has an answer to all of this. He says that the people will follow you when Moses is questioning this. The people will follow you because you have met me. And here's where I love when he comes down the mountain with the hair and the shining face and everything. Now, who's not going to see that something happened to this guy, right? So there's that. But he has a different persona. He comes down from that encounter with a sense of peace. Clearly, he's ready to lead. Moses, he's getting there. After this arguing out, he's getting there. He's getting to the point where he's going to be ready to accept this call from God. And God simply says in this book, the people will follow you because you've met me, because you know my name deep in your being. There's something about you that's, in the movie they make him real shiny. But there's something about a shiny, spiritually centered person that you want to know more. And you have a tendency to think, wow, that person is spiritual or centered, or they must know God. And then just lastly, so the author would call that the true self, and the power to accept the new responsibility. I'm living from my soul, my center, my most grounded self, and with God as much as I can be, receptive to God, hearing God, seeing God in all of you. This is the person that I want to move forward with and lead. And only God can keep me there, but I'm going to keep going back for more and more, because that's where I want to be. And that's where, later on, through God, all the miracles and magic happen, right, in Egypt. So one last quote here from an author, Greg Lavoie. Calls are essentially questions. They aren't questions you necessarily need to answer outright. They are questions to which you need to respond, expose yourself, and kneel before. You don't want an answer you can put in a box and set on a shelf. It shouldn't be easy. You want a question that will become a chariot to carry you across the breadth of your life. So, something big, something deep. And then we know, that it turns out pretty good for Moses. He connects with God, or God connects with him in a way that is clear enough for him to move forward and to become the leader that he's called to be. Go back. Did I have a question on callings? Yeah. Recall really quickly a life experience when you sense the question of calling.
Yeah, I was sort of stunned that I felt called to the Stephen ministry, but I'm very thankful because it's been a life-changing experience. It was totally out of my comfort zone, and I don't know why. Yeah, but it was the right thing to do.
And what made you listen to that call?
I don't know, it just kept coming to me, you know?
That's the persistence,
It kept
right?
pushing.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah, like Marilyn was saying, if you don't do it that first night when he calls to you in the middle of the night, it'll happen again. Yeah, there's persistence, yeah. Anyone else? The question of calling. And calling doesn't have to be a religious, spiritual thing. It's an everyday occurrence to respond to God's call.
I'd like to talk about transformation.
Okay.
We had a gentleman in our congregation who was an alcoholic. He wound up being in the house of correction, and he got on his knees and prayed that this would be taken away from him, and it was. And he decided that he was going to repay God by doing something positive. Started in the basement of our church, and my in-laws would bring a station wagon full of bread, and he would take it to Repairs of the Breach. There was a luncheon one day at church, and he asked Pastor Chris asked, what are you going to do with the food that isn't served? Well, we throw it away. He says, well, I've got a fella here that takes stuff to the homeless shelter. Well, I'll call my boss. So Sad said, tell him to come down every Thursday. I'll give him everything we have. Today, he has a warehouse on First and Capitol. He gets a Siebert grant for $250,000 a year, and he feeds hundreds and hundreds of people in the city. Transformation, if he hadn't come up with this idea of thanking God for what God did for him, you can look at this and say, whatever you do for God, and it's the right thing, God is on your side, and anything can happen.
And you,
and that did.
That's a great summary, Don, and because I know Chris Capper shares his story freely, he had his moment of self-examination. He had his moment where his family wasn't talking to him, where he had nothing but the substances that he was using. He had his moment of solitude and correction, where he was incarcerated for a while. He had his moment of paying attention when he sees the food and he gets the God spark idea of what should we do with this, right? And then he paid attention to the calling. So it's a really good example of the whole process.
And I've always lived with the words that Jesus said, what you do for my brothers, you do for me. I decided that this is something I'd like to help with. So I worked with him for 11 years until COVID came along, and then we couldn't serve meals at Cross Church. We couldn't package meals for them. And today we still do bag lunches for Repairs of the Breach. I feel I've been blessed, but I shouldn't just say that. I should share those blessings, and we should all share those blessings with somebody so that they're blessed also.
I appreciate your talking about water, the archetype of water, and to me the calling takes place for Moses when he doesn't know it, when he's lifted out of the water, the river, and then put into royalty to be educated, to train him for a future. He's not aware of it. And our baptismal hymns, if you listen to them, they're all about calling that child in baptism. And it's an accent that we don't hear much, but it's there in our hymns, that we're called in our baptism.
So he was called obviously not aware of it, and often we're not aware of our callings all the way through our life.
Amen.
But are you saying that he was called at that moment to be
Oh,
this leader?
absolutely, yeah.
But what an unconventional route to take.
Absolutely,
Yeah.
absolutely. And when he reached up and murdered that guy, he was protecting his people, that
Right.
anger. And then when he sets them free to go, he doesn't build an army.
Mhm.
He lets God take care of the power of the Pharaoh. I just love that.
Yeah, it's a really good story.
Yeah, it's a great story.
Mhm. Anybody else, a calling? Yep.
Sometimes within our Lutheran tradition, that's spelled with a capital C, call, and then you're referring to something specific like a call that you have as a teacher or a pastor, and it has a little bit different kind of a setting in mind. So sometimes over the years, people have said to me, so when did you feel that you had this call, capital C, you know, into the ministry? And I've got a lot of Baptist friends and others who can answer that very specifically and say, you know, I had this call when I was 14 years old and I decided to be baptized and whatever. But I could never really make that term work for me, that there was a moment when I had the call and I knew that that was when I needed to answer it. But I would say that in terms of some kind of spirituality, in my pastoral life, the moment when I most wrestled with something profound like that was when I'm struggling to understand a text and to apply it in a sermon. If people would ask, do you really enjoy preaching the sermon? Not so much. I really enjoyed wrestling with the text and coming to grips with what it was saying to me first and then to others. And that was my calling moment, probably.
And what a great one. Because it's always, God's word is alive and new every day, and you get to have a whole new calling experience, I think, when you're reading the word constantly. It's always speaking to us in a new way. And that might not be exactly what you're saying, because clearly you were called to preach and teach and lead vocationally as well, but we can all experience that call in the Bible every single day in some way.
So when you're talking about baby Moses kind of born into this destiny, I can talk about that call to ministry, but I can also tell you what I think is a funny story. But my dad, I'm about to finish seminary, and he unloads this burden of a bargaining prayer that he had made when he was like 20 years old, was in the Air Force, the Navy Air Force, and wanted to get into this pilot school. And so he gives the bargaining prayer and says, I promise one day one of my sons will be a pastor, right? But he remembers this now, and he had 4 sons and 1 daughter. and tells me this. I'm like, well, that's what happened. It's just, so I never quite know what if that was my destiny, like a Moses. That was my dad's fault.
Yeah, and we could be called in so many ways, called to serve, called to care, called to teach, called to learn, you know. There's just so many ways, but the process that we tried to illustrate today is if you take some time to pay attention to where you're at internally, God will meet you there. And maybe those calls or those moments will start popping up more frequently, or you'll simply have the eyes to see and the ears to hear when you're
Just to
centering
say it
God.
was women in the story that are the agency of the call.
Wasn't that something?
Yeah, they were women. That was a princess and a handmaid. I mean, it was the women, not the men.
In which story?
In the
Moses
Moses
story.
Oh, yeah.
Miriam.
The one
Yeah.
that kind of
Yeah.
ushered the call, you know.
Yeah.
The midwives.
Yeah, thanks for your patience with this today. I expected more theological debate, so thank you, pastors. Because it's not, the purpose of the story really is about spiritual formation, understanding that this isn't the typical Lutheran interpretation. There is credibility in spiritual formation and spiritual practices for Lutherans. There really is. I was lucky enough to go to a 2-year spiritual formation program, which was put on by a Lutheran seminary, or organized by and taught by and led by pastors. And all the spiritual practices are available to us as Lutherans. It's not something that is typically or not highly talked about in our faith story, or in our preaching or worship, but it's something that for some of us, if you're wired like this, you have to have it. So thanks for your patience today in going through this process. Any other questions before we close? We do have lots of books on spirituality in the library too. If it piques your interest at all, to learn how to be quiet, to engage in solitude, or so many other ways to connect and open your heart up to receiving the presence of God, which is what I think it all is. But here's a closing prayer for us. Teach me to stop and listen. Teach me to center down. Teach me the use of silence, and teach me where peace is found. Teach me to hear your calling. Teach me to search your word. Teach me to hear in silence things I have never heard. Teach me to be collected, and teach me to be in tune. Teach me to be directed. Silence will end so soon. Then, when it's time for moving, grant it that I might bring to every day and moment peace from a silent spring. Amen.
Thank you.
Thank you.